Hello, class. Professor Mandeville back. This is lecture number 5 for History 102. And we want to pick back up with the brand new radical Republican-led Congress with their 2/3 majority in both houses, and how they're really going to, under the leadership of Sumner and Stevens, punish the former Confederacy. And they're going to do that by passing the Military Reconstruction Act of 1867. This will once and for all determine what the Reconstruction process is going to be, and it's going to be very, very different from what President Johnson tried to implement. So, what it does, first of all, is it takes the former Confederacy and divides it into 5 military districts. Each one of these military districts is going to have a Union general in charge of it, sort of as a governor general, until the states meet the requirements to be readmitted to the Union. And each one of these Union generals is going to will have 20,000 Union soldiers under his command. So, soon as this is put into place, 100,000 Union troops in their blue uniforms come marching back down into the South, a sight that former Confederates cannot stand. Now, one thing right off the bat that I want to point out, and I'm going to scan a better map than what your textbook has, and also a chart on this, and it'll be posted in the mini lectures in Moodle that you can take a look at. You can either just look at it on your screen, or it'll be a PDF. You can print it out and do whatever you want with it. And you'll see these military districts in more detail, and the names of all the generals in charge of them and so forth. Now, one thing though that I want to point out right off the bat, one former Confederate state does not have to go through this process of military reconstruction or readmittance. That's the state of Tennessee. They're not going to be occupied again. They're not going to have to jump through all these hoops I'm going to explain to you, because they were smart enough to vote to ratify the 14th Amendment against President Johnson's wishes. So that will be their reward for being rational, I suppose. So they're going to divide the rest of the South into 5 military districts. One military district, district number 2, as you'll see on your map when you go to Moodle, is just the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. And the Union general that they're going to put in charge of that district of the 2 Carolinas is General Sickles. Now, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with General Sickles. We might have some Civil War buffs in the class, I don't know. But let me tell you a little bit about this interesting character. He was a highly decorated hero in the Union Army during the Civil War. In fact, he received medals for his bravery at Gettysburg, where he led the forces in one of the famous battles that took place there. If you've ever been to Gettysburg, you may have visited this site, the Battle of the Peach Tree Orchard. And at that battle, General Sickles was wounded. He was shot in the leg, and as I mentioned in a previous lecture, unfortunately, what will happen to you if you were shot in a limb, chances are they're going to amputate it. And they had to amputate General Sickles' leg. Now, General Sickles, being a general, could demand such a thing. He had the surgeons take his amputated leg and, I suppose you could say, pickle it, put it in a really huge jar in formaldehyde, I suppose, and preserve it. And then they gave it to him. So after the war, General Sickles will donate his amputated leg in this big giant glass jar to the Army Medical Museum in Washington, D.C. Now, after that, every early July on the anniversary of Gettysburg, General Sickles would make a pilgrimage to Washington to visit his amputated leg. So obviously, this guy was a real gung-ho, die-hard general. He's put in charge of the Carolinas. He's also a pretty close friend of Senator Charles Sumner. Do you think he's going to make life a living hell as the Governor General of South Carolina with 20,000 Union troops? You better believe it. And I'm sure he was in pretty close communications with Senator Sumner, telling him exactly how he was making their lives a living hell, and Sumner was enjoying every minute of it. Remember, he's the one who was caned by a South Carolinian. So, what these southern states are going to have to do to become states again and have the troops withdrawn is, first of all, they have to write brand new state constitutions. And in these constitutions, there's some specific requirements. They have to give voting rights to black males. They have to also make it a state law that high-ranking Confederates are not allowed to participate, even vote. And they must symbolically ratify the 14th Amendment. Now, so they would take these brand new constitutions that they wrote and they would submit them to Congress for approval. And if there was any little thing in that new state constitution that the members of the Congress, the radical Republicans, remember, didn't like for some reason, they'd reject it. Send it back and say, start over, write a new one. Took many of these states up to 10 years to be readmitted to the Union. Now, so by 1870, most states had successfully jumped through the hoops, but they still didn't do enough to have the troops withdrawn. The final troops that will be withdrawn due to military reconstruction will not happen until 1877. So there are several southern states, including South Carolina, that'll be under military occupation for the next 10 years. Something they can't stand. But you're the loser. That's what happens. So, military reconstruction was, detested by the former Confederacy, implemented by the radical Republicans. Now, next thing we want to talk about is the 15th Amendment, which will be passed in 1870, and that's the third of the Civil War amendments. It will give black males the right to vote. Now, in your book, in the chapter, there's some discussion about women's suffrage. Let me tell you a little bit about some history on this and how the 15th Amendment really disappointed women in this country and really re-energized the women's suffrage movement. Now, the women's movement in America, as most of you know, started in the 1840s with the famous convention in Seneca Falls, New York. And women then were fighting for equal rights, including the right to vote. And women had first gained the right to vote in 1869 in the Wyoming Territory. Then in 1870, the same year that the 15th Amendment is passed, Utah will give women the right to vote. So states out west are already beating the federal government to this. When they write the 15th Amendment, they decided that they were only going to give black males the right to vote, even though women's rights advocates lobbied very hard for universal suffrage, because if they gave black men and women the right to vote, they would then indirectly be giving white women the right to vote. Now, women had very high hopes that this would happen because at the very beginning of the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln called in the leadership of the women's rights movement, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Carrie Chapman Catt and others. And basically what he said to them in this meeting is he knew most of them had their origins as social activists being abolitionists, and they had fought against slavery, and then all of a sudden it dawned on them, hey, wait a minute, pretty fine line dividing a woman from a slave, we have absolutely no rights either. So that sort of transcended into two movements. So Lincoln basically said to them, what I need you to do is to really fight for the Union and to end slavery. We have to win this war to end slavery once and for all. So I'm asking you to sort of put your women's rights agenda on the back burner until the war's over, because we have to focus all of our attention on winning the war and ending slavery, ultimately achieving what the abolitionist movement wanted. So the women agreed. He then promised them, after the war was over, he'd take care of them. He'd make sure that women got the right to vote. Now, as we all know, unfortunately, in April of 1865, Abraham Lincoln's life is cut short, and he's not going to be in a position when the 15th Amendment is written and passed to push for and make sure that it gave universal suffrage to all people. So, women were very, very disappointed when they went to the House and Senate, lobbied for that, told them that Abraham Lincoln had promised them that, and they basically said, well, he never told us, and he's not here now, so we don't know what to tell you. This really inspired them to start fighting for the right to vote for women once again. They felt betrayed, and rightfully so. So, the next thing we want to talk about here today is there's a lot of pushback to the rights that the freedmen are slowly but surely gaining in the post-Civil War world or Reconstruction era in America. And the biggest culprits of this is going to be the famous, or I should say infamous, Ku Klux Klan. The Ku Klux Klan was founded in 1866 in the state of Tennessee. And initially, this group was nonviolent in its origins. And the Ku Klux Klan, what they originally did was, their purpose was they did not want African Americans voting in Southern elections, because their biggest fears were that they'd elect black politicians who then would punish the Confederates as much as the radical Republicans, and it was a big fear across the South. So, to try to initially persuade blacks from voting, and remember the 14th Amendment's going to say you got to let them vote or you're going to lose representation in Congress. They were very familiar with the freedmen. especially back when they were slaves. Many of these guys were slaveholders previously. And they knew that a lot of slaves, now former slaves, were very superstitious. And a lot of people were superstitious back in this day and age. And that they believed in ghosts. So, what they used to do initially to persuade blacks from voting, or basically scare them away from the polls, is they dress up in their old Confederate uniforms with white hoods over their heads. They'd ride up to a freedman's house in the middle of the night and wake them up with scary sounds. And then when the freedmen would come out on their front porch to see what was going on, they'd say in eerie voices that they were the ghosts of dead Confederate soldiers, and that if you vote in the next election, we will haunt you for the rest of your lives. Then they'd ride off laughing evilly, and in the beginning, this worked pretty effectively. Now, it didn't take long, though, before people figured out these guys dressing up like this aren't ghosts. They're guys from in town, like Fred, who owns the store or whatever. You know, one night they'd be riding off on their horses. They ride too close to a tree and it knocks their hood off and somebody recognizes them. And, you know, the whole trick is over. After these prank scare tactics stopped working, that's when the Ku Klux Klan turned extremely violent. And the Klan, especially in the election of 1868, which we'll be talking about in detail, but for our purposes today, that's the election when Ulysses S. Grant is going to be elected President of the United States. Now, once they had convinced Grant to run as a Republican, it wasn't a matter of if he'd win, it was by how much. How big a landslide is it going to be? Because he's the hero of the North and the victory of the Civil War. Now, preceding that election, the Klan went into evil action in the South. And today, we would just outright refer to it as acts of domestic terrorism. They were killing black people to scare them away from voting. They were beating them. They were tar and feathering them. They were throwing hot, burning oil on them. They were lynching them to make examples out of them, to scare away all blacks from the polls, because that's basically what they're using as an example. This is what's going to happen to you if you go and vote in 1868. In a 2-day killing spree in Louisiana, over 200 freedmen were killed. Now, in 1868, when the votes are all tallied up, Grant does not win by some outlandish landslide. The election is much closer than anyone imagined, and he lost in some southern states like Georgia. So this really woke up the federal government. They finally figured out by 1870 the reason why this happened was the Klan. So they're going to pass some acts in 1870-71, signed into law by President Grant, known as the Force Acts. And the Force Acts are basically going to do a couple things. They're going to make the Klan illegal, which the constitutionality of that is questionable, but at the time they got away with it, because you could make the argument that the Klan was a political organization, a violent one at that, and, you know, teetering on terrorism, and in many cases being terrorists, but you could make that argument. That's the argument that the Ku Klux Klan makes today, and that's why they still exist and can have parades and so forth. Now, the other part of it, though, and the more important part, besides making them illegal, was from that point forward, starting the election of 1870, every midterm and presidential election, a large contingency of federal troops were sent down into the South to personally escort freedmen to the polls if need be and to keep the Klan in check. So what's going to happen initially is, once the Klan knows they're illegal, they're all going to go underground. No longer would you have the headquarters of the Ku Klux Klan right in downtown Mobile, Alabama or whatever. They'd have to change their name to the Mobile, Alabama Gun Club or Dance Society, just to hide the fact of who they were. But they'd still have secret meetings, and they were up to no good. Now, very quickly, though, after military reconstruction ends, the Ku Klux Klan will just fade away into oblivion for a while because there's really no need for them in the South. As we'll find out later on, the Compromise of 1877 is going to end military reconstruction, and unfortunately, it's going to hand back the South to white racist Democrats. So, you won't need a Klan. They'll use state governments to manipulate the system. So, that's going to be the end of it today. I'm losing my voice for some reason. Must be allergies or the heat or whatnot. I'm doing this in one of our heat waves in July, but you'll be watching this obviously in late August. So, I'm going to call her quits for today. So what we're going to pick up with the next time I talk to you is we're going to talk about the first time a president ever goes through an impeachment proceeding. That's the impeachment of President Johnson. We'll talk about everything that leads up to that. Then we'll carry on, and we'll also talk about something positive that happens in the Johnson administration that's not done directly by Congress, but by one of his cabinet members, Secretary of State Seward. That's the purchase of Alaska. So, that's where we'll start up next time, class. Everybody take care, stay cool, be safe, follow all the rules, of the COVID-19, wear your masks, and I'll talk to you soon. Bye now.